Good afternoon. My name is Jack and this is Walt, and we are the Canada News Network. And I guess the reason we're doing this is we want to start to talk on television or video or YouTube, wherever we end up, about all the things that are never discussed by our corporate-owned media, or at least discuss those things from a different perspective. So we're going to film hopefully weekly or maybe even more often and put this stuff out, and hopefully we can begin a discussion about so many important things in this country. And we're going to start with something that isn't Canadian, the US election. So, Walt.
Well, you know, we've been watching the coverage like for the last 100 years, it seems, of this election. And there's so many things bizarre about American elections. They're really asking us to suspend reality. For anybody outside of the United States particularly, it's got into areas that we've never seen before. It's particularly in the sort of issues they're introducing into the election. Their ability to ignore completely the history of the Clinton family as well as the Bushes and all that, and just how, because of the history and that a large amount of Americans will never vote for Hillary Clinton. Now they're also saying that if you don't vote for Hillary Clinton, you have to vote for Donald Trump, and that's when things really do get bizarre. Is wondering how Donald Trump became a candidate, and is this just a complete farce? The question has to come up: is this a completely fabricated scenario? That there's nothing real in this election, and I think it's okay to think about that because the evidence supports that sort of view.
But what does that mean? That because to me it's a very real election, and the people who support Donald Trump are very real people. I think the base of the Republican Party has been so. They've realized that the people they've trusted, all those politicians who they've trusted for the last 20 or 25 years, have lied to them about everything. They realized that, and they absolutely refused to support any of those liars. And the only other guy in the race who was an outsider was Donald Trump. And you know, he's a nice speaker in many, many ways, so he's able to build a following. But those people have real issues and real problems, and they're just looking for a solution. And Trump has talked about some of the solutions, and I think the number one issue that he's talked about that has built his support is to get out of the free trade deals, because they've been disastrous for the American people. And those poor people, I mean, they were the believers. That's who votes Republican, are the true believers in the American system. And they've watched their jobs go overseas, they've watched the billionaires get ever richer, they've watched their cities collapse, they've been poisoned, they've been put out of their homes. They've had it, so they've turned, unfortunately, there was nobody, I mean, the guy who was there was Bernie Sanders. Yeah. But the Democrats made sure that he was unable to win. And I think after the convention, when Hillary was crowned the Queen of the Democratic Party, the entire leadership of the Democratic National Committee had to resign, because there was so much corruption in getting her elected. And so Bernie was pushed out and unfortunately did not take the opportunity he had to really step up to the plate of history and run against both of them. I mean, that would have been great, but that, you know, that's what happened. So now we're left with a disaster for the American people and the world, and it is a disaster. They're getting, you know, America is being destroyed by its corporate leadership, and people are stuck.
You know, it would be a couple of years ago, Jack, I wrote an article about how the federal election in Canada looked like it was fixed. And also, we certainly looked at the BC election in British Columbia in 2013 also had had aspects of it that really looked like there was some fairly major manipulation of the polling. The polling really did look like it was manipulated, and of course the media coverage really looked suspect in the fact that they were able to ignore some really big glaring problems with how the election proceeded. Now, if you apply that same sort of, let's say, analysis on the U.S. election, it gets into such another level of manipulation. And what I'm saying to you is that no doubt these people are suffering in the United States, and no doubt their economy's in trouble, and there's so many other things wrong with their foreign policy and the racism and the violence. I mean, it's just really a society in collapse. It's only the only way to look at it. But what I'm saying to you is that the narrative of the election is Donald Trump and how, how sexist and homophobic and all that he is, and all his awful policies on racism and all that. But the thing is that, to me, they look like two actors in play. Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump look like, to me, that they are on the same team. If you use this analysis, is that the people that really rule power, the people that really do control the media, are looking at these elections and going, okay, how are we going to get what we want out of it? How are we going to get, like, Stephen Harper elected again, even though he was never popular? How are we going to make these elections be manipulated in a way that we need? Well, we have to be able to control the media. And we know that the mainstream corporate media is pretty well controlled by very few people. So
well, it's not pretty well controlled by very few people. It's owned completely and totally by, in Canada, half a dozen corporations, and in the United States, half a dozen corporations.
Yeah.
And they completely control basically every word that is ever fed to us on their television, their radio, and their newspapers. And that, if we move into the Canadian scenario, is at the heart of the problems that we face, because Canadians are facing the same situation as the American people. Our society is being destabilized. Jobs are being removed and sent overseas. Our environment is under attack and being destroyed. The homeless roam the streets. People have to pay more and more for a place to live. We elect a new government that we believe is the antithesis of Mr. Harper or the smiling Justin Trudeau, and we're beginning to find already, a year in, that in fact Mr. Trudeau is Mr. Harper. And the fact is that he has to be, because the corporations run this country, and if they run our political parties, they run our governments, and they own our media. So if a politician wants to have a career, and he wants to stand up for the people of Canada, and he wants to stand against what the corporations are doing, he'll be destroyed. I mean, they will not allow that to happen. So you have to promise loyalty to the corporation before you even have a chance. And in the last election, I would say the corporations control the Conservative Party, the Liberal Party, and certainly my own party. I'm a member of the NDP. But I wouldn't vote for the people who are running for the NDP, locally or provincially or federally, because the party doesn't work for the membership anymore. The party is controlled by big business interests, just as the other big parties are.
Yeah, like what I'm saying is, I don't think we're at cross purposes here, but what I'm saying is that, number one, there's a narrative that's always comes out on a story, or a narrative about, say, the American election, and they've invented a narrative there that you have these two people that are opposing each other, and all that. But the thing is that I have wondered, and I think it's okay to wonder, is this just a total farce? Is this just a complete fabrication where these people sat back and said, okay, we want to have Hillary Clinton in office. She's our gal. She does everything we need on foreign policy, never saw a war she didn't love, never saw an arms spending that she never voted for. So we have, for the people that love warfare and create wars, she's their person. And they scratch their head a little bit and say, okay, how is it possible we're going to get her into office when she's so unpopular? Well, all we have to do is have a candidate that's even more awful. We're going to give the public a candidate that just is so repugnant that even Hillary Clinton could win. Now, I think it's okay to have that in your mind as a possibility of a scenario. Now, you don't have to have the facts. It's just okay to speculate. and wonder about that. And as you watch things unfold, it seems the pieces of the puzzle seem to put themselves together. And that's all I'm saying on that.
Okay. I would see it a little differently because I think the way the elite run the United States is one party gets their turn and then the other party gets their turn, so both sides have to be kept happy. But the problem for the elites was this time the membership of the Republican Party refused to endorse any of their great candidates. I mean, they had Jeb Bush there.
Yeah.
Jeb Bush was the next corporate guy, and a few others as well. I don't even remember the name, but they would have been very happy with any of them. But instead, what happened is Donald Trump came along and swept them all aside to the amazement of the establishment of the United States.
Yeah.
So then, of course, you know, and Donald Trump is almost Shakespearean in his, you know, everything. So, but they had to make sure that he can't get elected.
Yeah.
Because
Now, I don't
fine.
think that they're under any illusions, and there's been a lot of written about the fact that the Republican Party could never get elected again after the Bush regime because of demographics. That the Latino vote, the women's vote, the youth vote, the African American population growing. We have a situation where the Republicans knew that they could never get elected on the policies and the platforms that they traditionally have run on. So they knew well ago that they're never going to get elected as a president with what they have. So to me, the scenario is, okay, we're not going to get elected. Well, what's the next best thing for the people in power is to have the Clintons, because the Clintons have always done what was needed for them in the past. So I wonder about it. I'm looking at the election. It feels so unreal to me when I look at the debates and all this stuff that it really doesn't seem that it's viable and it's a real scenario. Another topic that Jack and I will want to be talking about is how housing is built in Canada, looking at the housing market and how it's structured, and you'll have situations like in Vancouver and Victoria too, incredibly high house prices that are really beyond the range for most wage earners, particularly the young, and we have to look at the questions as to why we're stuck in this sort of paradigm where you either have to be rich or inherit a house in order to be able to have one.
You know, it's funny, we live in the second biggest country in the world, Canada,
Yeah.
with a population of only 35 million people, and yet there's no land to build houses on, right? That's the big problem. I think what's happened is this. Homelessness and high house prices are the two ends of the same deliberate situation that has been created in Canada by the corporate sector and the government working together. They've deliberately underbuilt housing in Canada because somewhere along the line they realized if there's a shortage of housing, you can really make a hell of a lot of money. Why build and sell a condo for $100,000 when you can build and sell that condo for $250,000? Right? I mean, it's win-win for the corporate sector. Plus, they put us into debt. The reason there are so many homeless people in Canada is because there just isn't enough housing. It's not like there's thousands, you know, in Vancouver there are literally a couple of thousand homeless people and thousands more who are just on the edge of homelessness. And it's not that way because there are thousands and thousands of empty places which they can't rent because they don't have enough money. There's no place for them to rent and no place for them to get into. That's the problem. So our rulers have deliberately underbuilt housing. The federal government and provincial governments have basically stepped out of the game completely, left it to the private sector. And the private sector found the way for them to make the most money is to create a shortage. So for the people at the bottom of the economic ladder, the 1 or 2% at the very bottom, there's nothing. And for everybody else, we have to pay inflated prices for renting now or buying the place.
Okay, so Jack, but how do you see, in a broader perspective, how do you see this housing crisis and how it relates to other services in our society? Like, how do you see it relating to how people are treated for or handled with the drug addictions, or people with chronic mental health issues. And do you think that's also tied into the housing crisis?
Well, it seems that about 2 decades ago, the mentally ill were deliberately, right across North America, the mentally ill were put out of the hospitals that we had for them. And I think people agreed those weren't the best places, but it was better than being on the street. They closed those hospitals and long-term care homes for people who had mental problems, and basically didn't do anything else. The promise was there was going to be this great community-based system for them, but of course that was just a promise. They always knew that wasn't going to happen. So they put the mentally ill on the street and created even more of a homeless problem. The homeless people have destabilized towns and cities. I mean, they really, when you create that kind of a situation, you know it's going to destabilize your communities, and especially the city cores. And again, it's deliberate. It's not by accident. It's not because we can't build enough housing. It's because the banks and the big developers and the big land holding companies and the big corporations and the government and the media working together have deliberately created a situation that works for the people at the top and forces everybody else into debt. And when they have made a fortune as prices have gone up, and when they bring them down, they're going to make, I think, another fortune, and it's going to destroy this country. I mean, if house prices fall 10, 15, 20%, which they have to sooner or later, because just if interest rates go up a little bit, it will be a disaster for a lot of people. And I think the plan is you create the disaster, and when people wake up at the other end, we'll find that we're kind of like Greece. A lot of stuff will be privatized to pay off this debt that we got that has been deliberately created. That's the main part of it. And you know, the role of the media in all of this has got to be focused on. Because if the media told us, or even suggested that, is it a possibility that we've underbuilt housing in this country? I mean, obviously that's the case, but they won't talk about it. And the reason they won't talk about it is they don't want the public to think that way. And at the same time, over the last 7 to 10 years, both the government and the private sector have done all they could to push house prices up. Not only the underbuilding, but hey, get a 35-year mortgage. Hey, get a mortgage with no down payment. Hey, the federal government will guarantee a mortgage for anybody.
Yeah.
Hey, if you're a foreign investor, come into Canada, you don't even have to pay any taxes. And prices are going up 10% a year in some places in Canada. If you put your money in, if you're a foreign investor, you put your money into a European bank, they're giving you negative interest rates these days.
Yeah.
But you put your money into Canadian housing, there's a big profit, no taxes, you know prices are going up, the fix is in. So they've turned our housing into an international playground for the super rich.
Yeah, and you could always wonder also where that money is really coming from. There's very little controls and checking as to how that money was earned in the first place. Is this just especially in Vancouver, it's just not so elaborate money laundering scheme where they just buy condos and they sit there empty, but now they might have procured that money from illegal sources perhaps. Now they've bought real estate. Again, it becomes harder and harder to trace where this money originates at. And I think there's another whole level of the problem we see in the large metropolitan areas in Canada where prices are just beyond imagination. How could it possibly be that some little 3-bedroom house on a side street in Vancouver is worth like $4 million? Like, it just doesn't make any sense at all, except that the money that's being spent to buy that real estate has been money that's been gained in ways that might not be legal, and they're just looking for any way to launder it.
So I think we Canadians really got to ask ourselves, what kind of leadership and what kind of ruling class do we have that in order to make money will deliberately create homelessness and will deliberately create debt and make, especially young people who are trying to get into the market, make you work harder and harder to pay for just to pay for a place to live. What kind of society is that? And why are they doing it to us? And the reason they're doing it to us is that we Canadians have sort of become powerless. The corporations have completely taken over the country. And so we have no political party that will speak for us. We have no media that will speak to us, speak for us. And so the people at the top, seeing no resistance, are simply tightening the screws. And they're going to make them a hell of a lot tighter before they're done.
Now, I think we get lots of ground to plow on that, and and it's something that you and I are going to be talking about in the next few weeks, is really maybe drilling down a little further into the nuts and bolts and how this all works. Because if you do look at the economics, you start to see really strong trends, and you can see perhaps who's really pulling the strings. So I think what we like to talk about too is we're looking at homelessness. Of course, with homelessness, we're looking at all these other issues of mental health and drug addiction and all that. And something we should be talking about, I think, is the fentanyl crisis here worldwide, and how this introduction of this new synthetic drug onto the market in the last 3 or 4 years has caused thousands and thousands of deaths. And the most vulnerable people are the people that are homeless. So again, it's another issue that I think we should be really looking at very carefully and trying to understand.
So, I've been wondering, what is this fentanyl crisis all about? Why all of a sudden, or it seems like all of a sudden to somebody like me, this huge disaster is engulfing the entire country?
Well, there's a lot of aspects to it, and you get information in the media, and you're wondering what the veracity of the information, how accurate it is, and how do you figure it out. But one story is quite simple, that there was, of course, the use of opiates and painkillers is on the increase right across the board. Doctors are prescribing them. People are getting addicted. OxyContin was a popular painkiller, was being used for about 10 years, and it's done severe damage to a lot of people. It killed a lot of people outright, and also gave people a lot of heart problems. Now, around 2012, and one of these versions of the story of fentanyl was the OxyContin was starting to be banned in countries and restricted. So basically created a void. They needed a new drug, a new cheap drug that they could take and also lace with in the heroin to bring the potency of heroin up and more profits for the drug pushers and all that. And along came fentanyl. Fentanyl, for the most part, is manufactured in China.
But OxyContin was a prescription medicine.
Yeah.
So being given out by doctors.
Yeah.
But then, because it was killing so many people, its use was reduced.
Yeah.
Did fentanyl...
Well, OxyContin was being sold illegally on the black market.
Okay,
So there was various knockoffs of it, various other types of chemicals that were being used, being called OxyContin. But along came fentanyl. Fentanyl was a new synthetic drug. Huge amount of production of it, particularly in countries that we have no control over, like China. So a huge flood of this very, very potent drug came on the market. Now, fentanyl is at least 100 times more potent than heroin. So just the slight wrong dosage will kill you. And this is what we're finding out. The statistics in British Columbia are a good example, but this would be worldwide, wherever this drug's being used. Where you had maybe 250 overdoses a year for all types of drug use, illegal drug use, that shot up to about 600 or so. And now, that was in 2015, 2016, we're already past that.
Just here in BC?
Yeah, just here in BC. The thing is, interestingly, the authorities and the media report and said, drug death in BC is up, it's 135% above last year's, and that's a concern. Well, the thing is, what they're not talking about, Jack, is that drug deaths due to overdoses from these types of substances is up like, it's gone up, let's say, 10 times over the last, compared to 2013. It's a massive increase. It's not just a little bit over, 135%. Now we're talking like 1,000%, 1,200%. So it's much larger crisis than the numbers that are being reported. And we're not seeing the sort of legislation, the sort of regulation, the sort of actions we need from our chief medical health officer, for instance, although he has said a number of things, if you look at the chief medical health officer, he really does not have that much power. It's a political appointment. A lot of problems with our chief, the #1 guy that's supposed to be looking at after our health, but he's bridled by the political process. So the problem's even greater than what they're saying. And this is going to cause a lot of death and suffering, and a lot of people that use drugs recreationally, although we don't want to talk about that too much. There's a lot of sort of the irregular middle class folks that don't look like they're strung out on anything and are using a lot of these drugs.
Well, who is dying from this? And are people taking fentanyl deliberately, or is it being added to other things, or is it both?
Well, yeah.
Is it, why are people taking it?
Well, it's not exactly clear. I mean, heroin usually was the old staple drug that so many people were taking. And many cases, fentanyl is being added to heroin to up its potency. And people really don't know what they're buying. What used to be a dosage that was safe before is no longer safe. So people that have drug addictions for years and years and maintain a certain level of addiction but still are functional and are going out and working every day and productive members of society in many ways, these people are being harmed, killed. So it's something totally new.
And it's funny because I've been, like everybody else, you read about the massive numbers of people who are being injured and killed by fentanyl, but I have no idea why it's happening. I really don't, and even now I still don't.
Yeah.
Where,
there's so many unanswered questions, and again, the efforts that we have done over the years is always to try to drill into those stories and try to figure out what the heck is really going on here. But it's all tied up with how drugs are manufactured, particularly drugs that are coming from China. Massive amounts of fentanyl are coming from China. There's very little regulation or any way to control that. And we are, as long as that flow is allowed to happen at that rate, we're always going to have these problems.
Is it illegally?
Oh, yeah.
So it just, so it's like the other flow of illegal drugs. It just happens.
Yeah.
You can't control it. But if drugs were legal, then people could go to the store and buy whatever drug they wanted.
Yes.
And they wouldn't have to worry about the contamination.
Exactly. And if you think about the logic in that, and if you look at countries that have legalized or decriminalized a lot of drugs, for instance, Portugal and Spain and other countries, the problems that they're seeing with addiction is going down because they're looking at addiction as a health issue.
Which it is.
It's not a criminal justice issue.
Why should it be criminal?
Well, there's a lot of pressure on the system to generate things that are illegal because we have a whole society that's built upon breaking the laws and going to court and going to jail. And there's a lot of money being made in all these different places. So
plus it creates,
yeah.
Like for cannabis, which is now being legalized, you have something that's a weed and should cost like $1 a pound instead of cost $150 an ounce or whatever it is. There's big money to be made from making these things illegal.
Yeah.
And of course with cannabis, there's many other reasons why they want it illegal as well. It's a competition for a lot of the big corporations in many different aspects of their profitability, so they just want it gone.
Yeah.
But to me, the drugs should, and I agree with the former police chief of Seattle, who was a member of LEAP, which is Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, and I think he said that all drugs should be made legal, as you just said, and treat them as a health issue, because otherwise you so destabilize your society, which is exactly what they've done.
Yeah, and chasing after people for this is, these are not criminals. These are people that are trying to deal with their lives and the challenges they have in their lives. And you really, when you think about it, we should be looking at those issues too. Looking at why people are medicating. And it's a much bigger issue than I think we're being allowed to talk about as it is framed right now. And I think that's one of the things that we want to talk about in the future.
And this is exactly the issue, because when you go down a little way, you see that probably most Canadians, if they were presented with the honest facts about all the drugs that are legal, would say, well, let's just make them legal and treat them as a health issue. We never should have gone into the direction that we've gone. And yet our leadership, including the politicians and the media, have taken us over to here. Hundreds, well, thousands of people across Canada are dying every year because of this. It's deliberately caused for no reason that makes sense, except that some people, obviously very powerful people, are making a lot of money from this. And I seem to remember reading not too long ago that HSBC, which is one of the biggest banks in the world, was fined in the United States because they were laundering drug money by the huge quantities, not by accident, but just deliberately.
Yeah.
They were fined. Nobody went to jail. Nobody was paid a price. The corporation paid a small fee for, and they get away with it. The media doesn't. There was a little, oh, HSBC. So what we see is the people running our nation and the people running the world suddenly tied into illegal drugs, which are probably funneling money into the high housing market in Vancouver and Toronto. It's all this thing being used against us for the benefit of we don't even know who.
Yeah, and of course they're not going to be advertising other than the people who get caught and have to pay these fines and things. We very rarely ever get a glimpse of that world and how it really works. And it's really, again, I just like to say it's okay to wonder about it. How does it work? Let's try to figure out how that works. It's really okay to be curious and not to accept those pat answers that we see in the media every day, and then, by the way, that we see and being taught at universities, and we're seeing, mainstream thoughts are locked up in a certain paradigm that really, in the end, I don't think works, and it's not really going to find the sort of solutions that we need.
And I'd just like to move on to the issue of proportional representation, changing our voting system, which is, it was promised by Mr. Trudeau in the last election that the last election would be the final election using our old and what I would consider undemocratic voting system, and we were going to move to something else. Proportional representation, if we can get it, will change this country for the better. It's just more democratic, because what it does is it gives us the governments that we actually vote for. So if a party gets 10% of the vote, you get 10% of the seats, and if a party gets 40% of the votes, you get 40% of the seats. That's all proportional representation is. There's many different ways of doing it, but it really does break the control of the corporate sector over our government. The voting system we have now is the easiest for them to control. A proportional system is more difficult. That's why the media, of all people, is suddenly saying, oh, we want to be democratic, we have to have a referendum on this. Imagine these people who own our media, the corporations, pretending to care about democracy, which they care about. The only thing they care about democracy is that we don't get any. Why should they want democracy when the corporations run the country right now? So a voting system that allows a little more democracy will not be allowed. There is no way that Canada is going to get proportional representation unless the people of Canada realize how valuable it will be for them and stand up and demand it. Otherwise, it will be swept under the rug. And I'll give one small example. A friend wrote a story about Site C, which is a huge environmental and economic disaster in British Columbia.
Site C dam is
yeah. And he said we would not have that under a PR voting system, and I tend to agree with him. PR will give us people more control over our government, and that's why they just won't let us have it.
Well, there's a lot of interests that are feeling threatened by democratization, for instance, and proportional representation does lead to a more democratic and fair society in every other jurisdiction where it's ever occurred. So we don't have to wonder whether or not it'll work. But I think in the bottom line is that we have to realize that wherever we're getting our information, there's going to be biases. There's biases from political parties that have promoted different types of proportional representation. For example, in 2006, there was a referendum in British Columbia on whether or not to have introduced this type of proportional representation. It was brought by the Liberal government at the time, the Campbell government, and it was very popular and supported in British Columbia, and 57.5% of British Columbians voted in favor of having a proportional representation type government. But the bar that was set by the government and by the Liberals was 60%.
Because they wanted to make sure it didn't pass.
So there you have, firstly, you have this party that says something and then acts very unfairly. They want to correct unfair election practices, but they put one in, and for us to even ask for a change, it was unfair, the bar they set. The other thing is, if you looked at how the NDP behaved at that time, I think they were too embarrassed to come right out and, as a party, and say we're opposed to this. But they were opposed to it, and their leader was opposed to it. And by 2.5% of the electorate, we lost that referendum. Now, had the leader of the party at the time, was Carol James, very nice person, but very misguided on this issue, she was against it, and the referendum failed. So the point is, and I take this from you, is that referendums can also be gerrymandered and rigged, and the public can be misinformed, and I think the corporate entities would like to see a referendum happen because they've been able to manipulate that process in the past. We know we don't need it. The Liberal government ran on it. The federal Liberals said they were going to bring you a fair voting system, you get us elected. They got a mandate. Most Canadians in polling want to have some type of electoral reform. It's not unpopular. You can just go right ahead and do it. And there shouldn't be any more discussion on that. I think they should just introduce the new voting system for the next election.
And if people feel there should be a referendum, I like referendums. I think they're important to have. Then let's have a referendum after 1 or 2 elections with the new system, so we can see how the new system works. Right now, thanks to both our government and the media, nobody knows nothing about voting reform. Nobody, they've made no effort to inform the Canadian public about what proportional voting is and different systems for how it works, but they want us to have a referendum on whether we want it or not.
Yeah.
And it's as you say, they will make sure that they find a way that the referendum is controlled by them. So yeah, I would agree. Let's change to a proportional voting system for the next election. And I would like to see a referendum after either 1 or 2 elections. And then if we don't like the change, let's go back to what we have now. And I guarantee you that we will be a better country if we can get PR.
Now, I wonder if we could just move the conversation on to another topic, which is related to fairness in elections and things of that matter. It's what we're facing here in British Columbia, and particularly here in Victoria, with the new decisions that we've made to build a new sewage treatment plant here in Victoria. And that decision-making process was done by a entity, which we'll have to call it, it is a level of government, although it's not officially, is the Capital Regional District, which is operates under the auspices of the provincial government. They are governed by the provincial government. But the CRD itself is not elected, Jack, as you know. It's not directly elected. So we have city councillors that are being appointed to the CRD by mayors and others. And then the CRD turns around and appoints, the board of the CRD appoints a committee that makes a decision on a $1 billion project like the sewage treatment system. So what we're seeing here is a very unfair process of choosing our representatives, none of whom seem to be that attached to this issue, and now they're allowed to make a decision that's going to cost the taxpayers about $1 billion. So do you see that as a problem, Jack? And what I wanted to pose to you is the question, do you think the CRD should be directly elected?
Honestly, I don't think it'll make any difference, because I watch the way the people we do directly elect, the way they operate, and it's no worse than the CRD. I mean, what we have to do is somehow we have to gain citizen control over our governments. It seems we don't elect them to do what they want. We elect them to do what we want.
Yeah.
But once elected, they completely leave our grasp and move into the grasp, it seems, of the elites, the city elite, the provincial elite, and the federal elite. And from then on, they work for their real masters, and their job is to manage us.
But don't you see by removing these councilors' responsibilities, by city councilors sworn to make decisions that are good for the city that elected them? In our region, we have 13 municipalities with about 100 different city councilors, and out of that group, the mayors have the power.
I agree with you that there's problems with and maybe a directly elected CRD would be better. I'm just saying that the way it is, the actual on-the-ground fact is that when we directly elect them, they're just as bad.
Yeah.
Putting them through another process and creating a CRD, it can't be any worse.
Yeah.
The whole thing has to be fixed up.
See, the issues I have with it is that it's not being discussed. It's not an option. It's not on the table. But they call the CRD, and a lot of the political leaders are calling the CRD dysfunctional and an old boys club. And
the provincial government is dysfunctional. The federal government is dysfunctional.
Yeah.
And most of our city governments, certainly here in Victoria,
Yeah.
is also, I would say, dysfunctional. And
Yeah.
Vancouver too. I mean, Vancouver, the people there are getting killed with these huge developments and just go in and destroy neighborhoods, and their city government doesn't care.
Yeah.
None of our governments care. They've moved beyond us.
Now, but wouldn't you say, like in Victoria in particular right now, because we have such a governance problem here with these decisions that were being made, and you see a lot being written in the press about perhaps we should be looking at amalgamation of the municipalities. And municipalities could get together and make better decisions on regional development. That is the discussion that's being bandied about right now, whether or not we should have amalgamation of local municipalities. Now, in my view, that would be a step backwards. That, in fact, if you look at how these municipalities function, how these mayors and councils function, they're very responsive to the public because they're right there. They're at a very grassroots level, really, really tuned into the concerns and the problems of those communities, and they know full well about policing and fire protection and all that, and they know what's not working because they're right there on the ground. When you amalgamate into a large city like Halifax did, it is a very good example of a similar situation. You saw a lot less responsiveness by the city councilors. We saw taxation go up.
Yeah.
We saw other poor decision making, and they are also further and further removed from the public. So in my opinion, I think it's good to keep those city councils the way they are. There may be some amalgamation that might occur naturally with the different municipalities that share the same interests, that are in the same locations. But generally, I think, amalgamation is not needed to solve this problem. To me, the number one thing that's out of control in our area, in our region, is the CRD. Because they're not elected, they're not accountable. Just as simple as that. And I think the people that don't want to recognize that are promoting the idea of amalgamation as a solution, because it's kind of like a red herring. It's direct the attention away from the real problem here, is an unresponsive and unreelected CRD.
So those are the kinds of things we're going to be talking about on the Canada News Network. We agree on some things, we don't agree on some things, but we try at least to present a different perspective than you're getting in the corporate media. Thanks very much for watching.